Hey everybody, welcome back to the shop. So in a month from now, just under a month from now, I'm gonna get my first medical release from my back surgery. So that means I'll be able to lift more, I'll be able to spend more time on my feet and doing more stuff. Really trying to take it really careful with this. I don't wanna mess it up. But one of the things we're doing is bringing in a bunch of material to get ramped up for making a ton of content. And that means we need storage. So we're bringing in 1/2-inch plywood, 3/4-inch plywood. We've got some softwoods, some hardwoods. And then this A-frame style lumber cart it's always seemed to work the best over the years. I've tried lots of different style carts over the last 30 years, and I always come back to this one. So it always just seems we can get the most on here. It's the most functional, and we get the most use out of it. So I realize not everybody's gonna have room for a 4-foot by 8-foot lumber cart in their shop, but I thought you guys might enjoy the build process nonetheless. Okay, so to start off with, this project required 10 or 12 2x4s, one sheet of 1/2-inch basic inexpensive plywood, 2 sheets of hardboard, which was, I don't know what it was like 3/16 inches thick, and we used a couple scrap pieces of 1/2-inch plywood for the top of the A-frame. And to start off with, we cut everything up on the 2x4s to create this ladder of sorts that will be the base. So it's kind of like a regular framed wall. And I laid everything out on 16-inch centers, and then we used an air nailer to nail all the parts together. In this case, it's a standard framing nailer using standard size framing nails. Now you may have noticed I was just sighting down each of the boards, and I'm crowning the boards, and all that means is that I'm looking down each board individually, and if it has a little bit of a bow one way or the other, I push the part that bows up, and I face it actually up in the build. That way, if there's any discrepancies along that length of the ladder, all the bows will be facing in one direction. That just kind of helps keep it a little bit flatter and gives it a little bit more support. Now once the ladder frame was done, I needed a way to mount casters to the bottom of that ladder frame, because that's the part that's going to roll around on the floor. Now to do that, I just chopped up a couple chunks of 4x4 or 3.5 by 3.5, and then use the framing nailer again to nail them into each of the corners. Now I thought I had some legs around the shop, but it's one of those I'm sure you've run into experiences where you thought you had something and you couldn't find it, or you actually didn't have it. So in this case, I'm using power head screws or power screws, which are working great. They work fine. You know, those are 2.5 or 3-inch longs, super strong. When will work fine for this application. So after assembling the base and putting the wheels on, we're sheeting it with 1/2-inch plywood, or actually I think this is 3/4. Nope, that is 1/2-inch plywood. And I'm not worrying about squaring anything up because I'm actually using the plywood itself to square up the build. So I just nailed down one corner and go to the short side and line that up with a 2x4 so it's flush with the 2x4 of the frame. And then the same thing along the long axis as well. I'll just kind of go down starting at the beginning or at the corner where I nailed the first nail, and as long as everything's flush, I'll nail it down. And if it's not flush, I'll manipulate it back and forth to get that flush with the plywood. Now that squares up my whole frame. Now after I have it square, I can nail it down. Now in this case, I didn't use a full sheet because I took the minivan to pick up the material, so I had them cut it down at Home Depot so I could fit it in the van. And you see there again, I started by nailing one side, and then if there was any indiscrepancies, I can pull the plywood together and that squares everything up. So after the base was done, we started working on the A-frame. Now everything's cut to a 7-degree angle, so there's a 7-degree bevel on each piece that we cut. Now with all of our pieces cut, it's just a matter of kind of laying it out and nailing it together. Now the first one always takes a little bit more time because you're taking all the measurements, making sure all the parts are fitting right. And then again, just nailing everything together. This is really all this build needs, and at this point our interest is in just getting the project done so we can get all the material that we purchased onto the framing or onto the lumber cart. Now we're building 5 of these frames to go down the length of the lumber cart. And once we had the first one done, I can just go use that first one as a template to build the other 3. I don't have to worry about laying out all 3. And from that point on, it's just a rinse and repeat. So to make sure this thing, the A-frames were centered, I started by putting one of the A-frames on the end, making sure it was flush with the outside of the cart, then just measuring the distance and then splitting that distance in half. Now Brad measured down the same distance from the other side, and then we just ran a chalk line down the length of the material, or the length of the base, that we could butt our A-frame frames up to. Now to secure these, again, I'm just using the framing nailer and I'm toe nailing each one of these into the frame below it, or to the material below it. And again, it's really all it needs. We don't need to go crazy with, trying to flip this over and drill it from the bottom or anything. Just toe nailing with some framing nails was all it needed to be very sturdy. So after Brad laid out the distances, so we have equilateral distances down the cart, we've nailed everything into place. And then from here, we're going to switch from a framing nailer to a stapler and add on our 3/16 hardboard. Now, to be fair, the hardboard is really not a structural element. It does help the A-frames from racking back and forth. And if we stack short pieces of plywood on there, like scrap pieces, it's not going to fall through the A-frame. So, it's good to have it on there. Now the last thing to really cut up, or actually second to last thing to really cut up, was the top. So I wanted to have a top on top of the A-frames going through, and for that we're just using some 1/2-inch plywood that I had in the shop. And that's going to get screwed down on top there. Again, not really needed, but it's just one of those things. It's an extra flat surface to put scrap material and those kind of things that you would think of putting on a flat surface. Besides the casters, those are literally the only screws in this build. So after we put the top on, the last thing to do was to put toe kicks on at the bottom of the frame, so when we stack plywood up, it can't slide out from the bottom and then slide off the cart. So Brad just he just used the stapler to kind of tack them in place, and then came back and screwed those toe kicks in. And we just left them up about 3/4, I think it might have been a 3/4 to an inch high. It wasn't very high. And with the cart done, the most fun is loading the cart. So Brad's loading some alder into the center there. We put softwoods on the top of the middle A-frame, and then we had some small slabs that we put on the bottom. Now, even though this thing is on wheels, it's going to be very heavy when it's completely loaded down. So we moved it close to where its permanent location will be and loaded it up there. Now, as you can see, that plywood we're using sticks out above the top of the cart, and that's because I buy a lot of Baltic birch, and I buy it in 5x5 sheets, so it obviously sticks up high. Now we were able to get everything on here. We had three sheets of 1/2-inch MDF to put on. We had a couple sheets of bendy board. We had a bunch of 3/4 inch and 1/2-inch 5x5 Baltic. Literally we're able to go around the shop and put pretty much everything on there minus short scrap pieces. Now I'm not a big scrap guy. I know a lot of people are. I don't really hang on to scrap. I either donate it to our local makerspace, Synergy Mills, or I do the other thing. I burn it. But we roast marshmallows on it, so it serves a purpose. Now, once we got this thing all loaded down, again, even with the wheels on it, it's super heavy. So we're really not planning on moving this a whole bunch, but it is nice to have it so we can move it when we do need to. And once we got it all loaded up, it took Brad and I both literally on each side of the cart to kind of push it into its position. So there you go. Not every shop project has to be all fancy, and in my case, a lot of times it's just about getting it done so we can move on with our life and get on to those next projects. And that was definitely the case with this one. Just a really easy build, great for storage, and I'm really glad to have this in the shop. It's been, having material kind of laying around loose has been a little bit of a nightmare. Now we've got a nice one spot fits all for it, and we can move it around when we need to. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll be talking to you soon.